How's it going, fight fans? Welcome to mindforcombat. If you're new to the channel, my name's Rohan, and in this video I'm going to be breaking down a hypothetical fight between Nick Diaz when he was in his prime, so around the Strikeforce mark, versus current form Jorge Masvidal. Now this is a really fun fight. This is a fight that really I've been thinking about since there was kind of rumours of this fight happening early this year, and then Jorge Masvidal got matched up with Darren Till instead, and Nick Diaz never happened, it kind of faded away. Jorge Masvidal's gone on to have like the best run of his career this year, and then Nick Diaz has stayed silent in retirement. Now, having seen Jorge Masvidal versus Nate Diaz, that kind of gives us a little bit of perception on how it could have gone, but I don't necessarily see that as, whilst we have small indicators, and that would have been a great way for George to prepare for Nick. Nick was a very different fighter in a lot of ways to Nate Diaz, my personal favourite fighter of all time, and I may never get to break down one of his fights, as likely I probably won't. So the only way I can do it is by doing a fantasy fight breakdown, and this is one that I've always wanted to do, so let's break this one down. When you're looking at this fight, there's a couple of things that spring to mind. Firstly, they will both definitely meet each other in the middle of the cage. They both like the fight. It would have been similar to the Nate Diaz and Jorge Masvidal fight that we just seen, because their styles were very similar. The difference between Nick and Nate Diaz is that Nick is a bigger, naturally bigger fighter who was fighting at 170, and he was a bigger 170, and then he fought at 185 as well, and he didn't even get finished by Anderson Silva back when Anderson Silva was on all the steroids. Especially when you're comparing Nick and Nate as well, another thing that you got to consider is that Nate probably doesn't carry as much power in his hands as Nick did, and I always felt like Nick was slightly more well-rounded, a slightly better wrestler, slightly better kicks, obviously not massively, but slight differences that make a difference. So how do I think the fight would have played out, particularly with prime Nick Diaz against current form Jorge Masvidal? Having seen everything we've seen lately, let's break it down. So the first thing that I normally do is look at the age. This is an irrelevant stat in a fantasy fight breakdown. Obviously, they're 36 and 34 now respectively, completely irrelevant. So let's move on from that. Nick Diaz currently, as it stands, has a professional mixed martial arts record of 26 wins, 9 losses and 1 no contest. Obviously, he's lost essentially 3 fights in a row if you consider the Anderson Silva fight as well. But around the time that I'm pitching this fight at, he was probably 25 and 7, 26 and 7, around the BJ Penn, Paul Daly, around that time. That's when I felt like Nick Diaz was at his peak, and Jorge Masvidal has a professional record of 35 wins and 13 losses. He rides 3-fight win streak, best form currently in his career right now. Nick Diaz stands at 6 foot tall. Actually, he's more close to 6'1". I think he's like 6'1.5", whereas Jorge Masvidal stands at 5'11". So Nick Diaz would have had that slight inch and a half height advantage over him. And Nick Diaz also would have enjoyed a 2-inch reach advantage over Jorge Masvidal. Nick Diaz has a 76-inch reach, similar to his brother, and Jorge Masvidal has a 74-inch reach. Nick Diaz's style, similar to his brother, it was that pressure boxing style where he would be putting a relentless pace on you, throwing punches the whole time. He wouldn't stop at all, completely relentless pressure. And if he got the opportunity, he was going to submit you with that armbar, triangles, rear naked chokes, whatever it is. Look at the finish of Hayato Sakurai. Look at the finish of Evangelista Cyborg. All great finishes. Whereas Jorge Masvidal, he's kind of got a more well-rounded style. Yes, he's been finishing people with his hands and feet, but he can do it all. He can box, he can kickbox, he can grapple, he can do it all, and he likes to implement it all into his game when he's fighting, which is something that I think a lot of fight fans appreciate about Jorge Masvidal, now that we're getting to see just how well-rounded he is. Let's look at some of the key wins. For Nick Diaz, because he was fighting for such a long time, from so long ago, you're looking way back in time, and you're looking at guys like Drew Fickett, who was a real top contender at one point in time. Gleison Tibau, when he was a relevant young buck back in them days. Takanori Gomi, when Takanori Gomi was on top of the world. He had that fight turned into a no contest, but we saw him get that win in one of the best fights of all time. He beat Takanori Gomi, who was the best lightweight in the world at the time. He beat Frank the Legend Shamrock in a fight that was heavily billed as him being the underdog, being too small for Frank Shamrock, and Frank Shamrock, the re-emerging face of mixed martial arts, which was a great period of time for Nick Diaz, and I really enjoyed that fight, the build-up to that fight. He also had wins over the likes of Paul Semtex Daly, who had actually was on that time when he beat when he lost to Nick Diaz, was on a win streak when he had beaten Jorge Masvidal in the win streak going into the fight with Nick Diaz. Interesting bit of trivia there. And of course, he beat BJ Penn back when BJ Penn had just come freshly off his draw with Matt Hughes and knocking out Matt Hughes and draw with John Fitch. With George Masvidal now, we're looking at more of his recent form. He's got some really good wins recently, but even if we go further back, because he's been around for so long, he's got wins over the likes of Eve Edwards. When he came to the UFC, he beat Tim Dirty Bird Means when Tim Means was unbeaten in the UFC. He gave Michael Chiesa the first loss of his career. He's beaten Don Cerrone when Don Cerrone was 4-0 at welterweight. He's beaten the likes of Darren Till. Obviously, that's a key win. Ben Askren and now Nate Diaz. Great wins. They both got great resumes, and this is a great fantasy fight. The issues for Nick Diaz would have been his susceptibility to leg kicks. George Masvidal does throw leg kicks, and that would have been George Masvidal's biggest weapon in this fight. And for George Masvidal, his weaknesses would have been his willingness to engage in Nick Diaz's terms. Brawls tended to suit Nick Diaz, and secondly, I do question his conditioning. I'll talk about that a little bit more, but even after the last Nate Diaz fight, I do question it. The X factor for Nick Diaz would have been his conditioning, kind of goes on my last point, and the X factor for George Masvidal would have been his well-rounded game, his ability to mix it all in and throw the leg kicks, etc. Let's get into my prediction. Now, although we saw George Masvidal dominate Nate Diaz, there was a truth to that fight that I believe is kind of being overlooked. He absolutely dominated Nate Diaz in the first round. He handedly beat Nate Diaz in the second round, and he definitely won the third round. But what I saw was, and although George Masvidal says he wasn't going to gas, he was going to come stronger, what I saw was, although the success was small and relative to how bad the previous rounds were, Nate Diaz started to have some success in that fight, and he started to land some shots on George Masvidal, and that's a very interesting thing to consider, especially considering the fight would have gone on. The difference here is that Nate Diaz probably doesn't take a punch as well as Nick did, and definitely doesn't hit as hard as Nick did. So Nick would have had more success in them exchanges than Nate Diaz did. Although I still feel that George Masvidal would have won the earlier rounds, I think that Nick Diaz would have been able to do more damage with the shots he would have landed. I also think Nick Diaz had enjoyed faster hands than Nate does, and also he was just better at boxing generally all round, so that would have meant that he had more opportunities to land more punches. George Masvidal would have probably won the earlier rounds, but Nick Diaz would have been swarming him. He would have been stuck on him like glue. He wouldn't have had a moment to breathe. Nick Diaz would have stayed on his face the entire time. Last time I said that Nate Diaz was going to lose the first 3 rounds, and I think he'll win the next 2, but it'll be too little too late. Do I think that's the case in this fight? I think George Masvidal would definitely win the first round. Would he have won rounds 2, 3? I don't know. I definitely don't think he would have won rounds 4 and 5. Round 3 is debatable, but I would have given round 2 is debatable, but I would have given round 3 to Nick Diaz as well. In my opinion, the fighting style of George Masvidal in his current form suited Nick Diaz and the style that he brought. And having seen the Nate Diaz fight, I see that George Masvidal, yes, he does start to slow down slightly, despite what he says about his improving conditioning. I don't disbelieve him. It may have improved a lot, but I still think that Nate would have enjoyed that advantage, because I felt like I was starting to see Nate have little bits of success. Now, that's a very relative term. In my opinion, this being a brawl, it would have suited Nick Diaz. Nick Diaz would have been able to put the pressure on him from the moment the fight started, and as the fight wore on, that pressure would have become more and more evident. As George Masvidal slowed down, Nick Diaz would have gotten stronger and stronger and stronger. Nick Diaz was a guy who was historically noted for his condition. I believe it was Andre Berto that said he spars with Nick Diaz. He dominates him in the early 2-3 rounds. It gets a bit more competitive in rounds like 4 through 7, and then he loses rounds 8, 9, 10, stuff like that. That's how good Nick Diaz's conditioning was. So fight fans, for my official prediction in this fantasy fight breakdown, I will pick that Nick Diaz would have won an overall decision against George Masvidal, winning rounds 3 through 5, and maybe even a bit more convincingly, or maybe he might have even won the earlier rounds as well. So fight fans, I would have gone with Nick Diaz in his prime to have beaten BMF George Masvidal. I'm getting really tongue-tied there trying to remember that. Sometimes I speak so fast that I get tongue-tied to try and keep up with myself, but I've got to slow that down, get better at delivering these videos. Anyways, fight fans, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Let me know if you like these types of video. I got a few more planned, or I'm planning to do a few more over the weeks, and I'll be interested to know your thoughts on this, especially with there not being tons and tons of MMA going on. I don't think there's another UFC card after Zabit until December 7th, and I don't want to give you guys no content. I want to keep getting content up. So guys, let me know fantasy fight breakdowns that you want to see. Comment below on this video. Let me know how you would have seen this fantasy fight going, and thank you for watching, guys. Like I said, if you're new to the channel, like the video, subscribe to the channel, share out the video, all that jazz. Thank you for watching. I'm Rohan. This is Mindful Combat.